The laughter started small, the way cruelty usually does. One man's chuckle, then a second, then the whole barroom rolling with it, until an old man in a threadbare coat stood alone at the end of the bar, with his shaking hand around a glass of ginger ale he could barely afford. His name was Harold "Hal" Pruitt. He was 64 years old, and he had just made the mistake of telling the truth. Remember that. He told the truth, and a room full of men laughed him down for it. Nobody in that tavern in Cedar Falls, Iowa, on that cold February night in 1959, knew that the quiet stranger sitting in the corner booth had already heard every word, and that before the night was over, he would say 6 sentences that would silence the whole room and make grown men look down at their boots in shame. There is a thing about a man who has lost everything but his memories. When you laugh at his memories, you are laughing at the last thing he owns. And some men, when they see that, cannot let it stand. Hal Pruitt set his glass down. His hand trembled, not from fear, but from the weather in his bones, from 23 winters of hard work after the war ended. He looked at the bartender and said quietly, "I flew. I did. Over France. I don't tell it to be somebody. I tell it because it's true." And the room laughed harder. They didn't know that a legend was listening. They didn't know that within the hour, that stranger would rise from his booth, cross the floor, and name the squadron, the exact squadron, the number, the airfield, the men, before Hal Pruitt could say another word. They didn't know any of it yet, but they were about to learn something they would carry for the rest of their lives. That the loudest man in the room is almost never the bravest, and the quietest one at the bar might have done more for his country than all of them combined. This is the story of the night the laughter died. To understand why that night mattered, you have to understand Hal Pruitt, and almost nobody in Cedar Falls ever bothered. He had come to town in 1946, a year after the war ended, and he had come quiet. He rented a room above the hardware store on Main Street, took work wherever a man could find it, hauling feed, mending fence, sweeping the floor of the grain elevator when his back would allow it. He was polite. He tipped his hat to the women. He never raised his voice. And in 13 years, he never once bragged about anything. That was the strange part, the part folks would remember later with a hot flush of shame. In 13 years, Hal Pruitt had never told anyone he had flown in the war. Not once. He'd sat through countless 4th of July picnics, while younger men told loud stories about their basic training. He'd said nothing. He'd let them talk. He had a wife once. Her name was Clara, and she died of a fever in the winter of 1951. And after that, Hal Pruitt got quieter still. They'd had no children. When Clara went into the ground, the only mourners were Hal and the Lutheran minister, and a widow named Edith Voss, who brought a covered dish and stayed, because it seemed wrong to let a man bury his wife alone. Hal kept one thing from the war. It was a small tin box, no bigger than a Bible, and inside it he kept a photograph, a set of silver wings, tarnished, nearly black, and a letter folded so many times the creases had worn through. He never showed the box to anyone. Edith Voss saw it once, by accident, when she came to bring him soup during a bad spell of pneumonia in 1957. She saw him holding the wings in his open palm, staring at them like a man reading a language only he understood, and she had the good sense to say nothing and slip back out the door. That was the whole of what Cedar Falls knew about Hal Pruitt, a quiet old man, a widower, good for a day's work when his back held up, nothing more. And because that was all they thought he was, they felt free to laugh. The men who gathered at the cattleman's tavern were not evil men. That's the thing you have to sit with. They were farmers and mechanics and a young insurance salesman named Dewey Frank, who had never been more than 60 miles from the county line. They worked hard, they loved their families, and on a cold night, with money on the bar and warmth in their bellies, they found it easy, too easy, to make sport of a man who couldn't fight back. It started because of the television. There was a war picture playing on the set above the bar, fighter planes diving through a grey sky, and Dewey Frank pointed his beer at the screen and said something loud about how his uncle had been a real hero, a Marine, and how most of the men who claimed to have seen action never got closer to a battle than the newsreels. And old Hal Pruitt, from the end of the bar, said quietly, not to argue, just to say a true thing, "I flew planes like that, over France." He should have known better. A wiser man, a more guarded man, would have kept his mouth shut. but some nights the loneliness gets so heavy that a man will reach out toward anyone, even a room that doesn't want him, just to feel for one moment like he belongs to something. Dewey Frank turned. He looked the old man up and down, the frayed collar, the shaking hand, the shoes worn thin at the toe, and he smiled the way young men smile when they've found something to be cruel about. "You?" he said. "You flew fighter planes?" And that was when the laughter started. Here is how cruelty works in a small room. It needs a leader, and it needs permission. Dewey Frank was the leader. He was 26, handsome in the way that fades fast, and he had the kind of confidence that comes not from having done anything, but from never having been told no. He set his beer down and leaned back against the bar, and he said, loud enough for the whole room, boys, listen to this. Old Hal here flew fighter planes. In the war. Hal Pruitt, the ace of Main Street." The permission came from everybody else. Not all at once. First it was two men near the pool table, then the fellow playing the pinball machine, then even the bartender, who should have known better, ducking his head to hide a grin. "What'd you fly, Hal?" Dewey called out. "One of them crop dusters." The room laughed. "Bet you shot down the Red Baron himself," someone else said, and Dewey liked that, and he ran with it. "Sure he did. Tell us, Hal, how many did you get? 100? 200? You must have won the whole war yourself, a big-time flyer like you." Hal Pruitt stood very still. He had both hands wrapped around his glass of ginger ale now, and the trembling in them had gotten worse. And the worst part, the part that a decent man would remember for years afterward, was that he was not angry. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had made this mistake before and had promised himself he never would again. And here he was, an old fool, having made it once more. "I don't want any trouble," Hal said softly. You only meant to lie to us," Dewey said, and the smile was gone from his voice now, and something meaner had come up underneath it. "That's the thing that gets me. Real men died over there. My uncle's got shrapnel in him to this day. And you stand here in your busted-up shoes, and you make a story out of it so folks will buy you a drink. That's low, Hal. That's about the lowest thing I ever heard." The room got quiet then. Not because they agreed with what Dewey had said, some of them, in that quiet, felt the first cold touch of shame, but because the joke had turned into something with teeth, and nobody knew what to do with it. Hal Pruitt set down his glass. His voice, when it came, was so quiet the men had to lean in to hear it. "I don't need a drink from anyone," he said. "I've got my own money, and I never lied about anything in my life." He reached into his coat, slow, careful, an old man's careful, and he took out the tin box. The box nobody in Cedar Falls had ever seen. He set it on the bar and opened the lid with fingers that would not stop shaking, and he took out the silver wings, tarnished, nearly black, and he laid them on the wood. "I flew," he said. "You don't have to believe me, but I flew." And Dewey Frank, God forgive him, reached over, picked up the wings, turned them over in his hand, and laughed. "You can buy these at any pawn shop in Waterloo," he said, and he tossed them back onto the bar, so they skidded and nearly fell to the floor. $2, maybe $3. That was the moment. That was the exact moment when, from the corner booth in the back of the cattleman's tavern, a chair scraped slowly across the floor, and a very tall man stood up. "Before we go on, let me ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly in your own heart. Have you ever watched someone get laughed at and said nothing? Have you ever seen a quiet person, an old person, a person who couldn't defend themselves, get made into a joke, and you told yourself it wasn't your business? Most of us have, and most of us carry a little of that shame, tucked away where we don't look at it often. If this story is stirring something in you, do me a small kindness. Type the word honor in the comments below, so we know there are still folks out there who believe an old man's word ought to count for something. And if you believe the ones who serve deserve better than laughter, subscribe and stay with us, because what happens in the next few minutes is the reason this story has been told for 60 years. Now, back to the tall man standing up in the corner. He was a big man. That was the first thing anyone noticed. He filled the doorway of the booth as he stood, and he had to duck slightly under the low beam, and he moved with the particular slow ease of a man who has never once in his life needed to hurry to be taken seriously. He wore a plain canvas coat and a hat pulled low, and he had been sitting in that corner for the better part of an hour, nursing a cup of black coffee, saying nothing, listening to everything. The men in the bar had paid him no mind. Just another traveller passing through, waiting out the cold. He crossed the floor without any hurry at all. His boots were loud in the quiet room. He came to stand beside Hal Pruitt, not in front of him, beside him, shoulder to shoulder, the way you stand next to a man you've decided to stand with. And he looked down at Dewey Frank with a pair of eyes that had seen a great deal and forgiven most of it, but not this. "Son," he said, and his voice was low and slow, and it carried to every corner of that room. "You just picked up a thing you don't understand, and you called it a lie. I'd like to help you understand it before you say another word you'll be ashamed of." Dewey Frank opened his mouth, but there was something in the way the big man stood there, something patient and immovable, like a mountain that has decided to have a conversation with you, that made the young man close it again. The stranger reached down and picked up the tarnished silver wings from the bar. He held them up to the light, turning them slowly, and every eye in the room followed them. "These aren't pawn shop wings," the big man said. "These are pilots' wings, United States Army Air Forces. And this old man you've been laughing at," he set the wings gently back into Hal Pruitt's shaking hand and closed the old man's fingers around them. "Didn't fly crop dusters, and he didn't buy a story to earn a free drink." He turned to face the room. "His name is Harold Pruitt," he said, "and in the winter of 1944, he flew a P-51 Mustang out of an airfield in England with the 357th Fighter Group, the 362nd Fighter Squadron. They painted the noses of their planes yellow. They called themselves the Yoxford Boys, after the English town nearest the base. And this man," he laid a hand on Hal's thin shoulder, "flew 68 combat missions escorting bombers into Germany, when the life expectancy of a fighter pilot was measured in weeks, not years." The room was dead silent now. "You want to know how I know that?" the big man said quietly. "I know that because it's my business to know it. And because there are things a man doesn't forget. Let me pause here because I think this is the part of the story that matters most, and I don't want it to rush past you. Have you ever kept quiet about the best thing you ever did, because bragging felt cheap, and the memory felt too holy to hand over to strangers? Have you ever watched the world hand its praise to the loud and its scorn to the humble, and wondered whether goodness was even worth it? Have you ever hoped, really hoped, that somewhere out there, someone knew the truth about you, even if you never said a word? Hal Pruitt had hoped that for 13 years, and on a cold night in Iowa, in a bar full of men who'd laughed at him, that hope came walking across the floor in a plain canvas coat. They don't make many men like the one who stood up that night, but they made a few, and this is why we remember them. Stay with me, it gets better. Dewey Frank had gone white. "How would you know all that?" he managed. "How would you know about squadrons and airfields and—" The big man didn't answer him directly. Instead, he pulled a chair out from a nearby table, turned it around, and sat down facing Hal Pruitt, close, the way one soldier sits with another. And he began to talk to the old man, as if the rest of the room had disappeared. "You flew top cover the day they hit the marshalling yards outside Frankfurt," the stranger said quietly. "March of 44. The weather turned bad and half the group got scattered. Am I right?" Hal Pruitt's mouth opened. Nothing came out. His eyes had filled. "You are," Hal whispered. "God above, you are." The stranger leaned in closer, his elbows on his knees, and for a moment the bar and the men in it fell away completely. There were only 2 pilots left in the world. "Tell me if I've got it wrong," the big man said softly. The clouds came down over the Rhine, like somebody had pulled a grey blanket across the sky. The formation broke apart trying to climb over it. I was 17 years old, and I'd never flown combat in my life, and I lost sight of my element leader in about 4 seconds, and then I was alone up there, alone in a sky full of men who wanted to kill me. Hal Pruitt nodded slowly. His hands had gone still. "I remember the cold," the stranger went on. "I remember how quiet the radio got, all that static, and me calling out my call sign over and over. 'Anybody, this is Yellow 4, I'm lost, does anybody read me?' And nothing coming back. And then 3 shapes came out of the cloud behind me, Focke-Wulfs, and I knew, the way you know a true thing all at once, that I was going to die over Germany, and my mother would get a telegram, and that would be the whole of my life." "I heard you," Hal said quietly. His voice had steadied. "On the radio, I heard a boy calling out that he was lost. I was maybe 40 miles off, headed home myself, low on fuel and glad to be leaving. And I heard this boy, and I couldn't make my hand turn the plane away from that voice. I tried. God knows I tried. My whole body wanted to go home, but my hand wouldn't do it. The big man's jaw worked. "You came out of the cloud like the hand of Providence," he said. "I'd never seen anything like it. This yellow-nosed Mustang dropping out of the grey with its guns already going. You knocked one of them down on the first pass. I watched it come apart, and the other two lost their nerve and broke off. And then it was just you and me up there, and you pulled up alongside me so close I could see your face." "You were white as a sheet," Hal said, and a small, sad smile touched his mouth. "White as a communion cloth, eyes big as saucers." "I was terrified." "So was I," Hal said. "That's the thing nobody understands about it, son. Being brave isn't about not being afraid. I was scared the whole way home. I just decided I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you." The stranger had to stop and press the back of his hand against his mouth before he could go on. "You talked to me the whole way across the channel," he said. "The whole way. About nothing. About your wife's cooking. About a dog you had as a boy. About what you were going to do when the war was over. And I understood later that you weren't making conversation. You were keeping me alive. You knew a green kid alone with his own fear will fly himself right into the sea, and so you filled up the quiet so I couldn't fall into it." "You made it," Hal said simply. "That's all that matters. You made it home." "On fumes," the stranger said. "Both of us. I found out later your engine quit on the taxiway. You'd cut it that close going back for me. You had nothing left." "I had enough," Hal said. "A man usually finds he's got just enough, if what he's spending it on is worth it." He reached into his own coat and drew out something small and worn. He set it on the bar next to the tin box. It was a photograph, old, cracked, handled soft as cloth. A photograph of a young pilot standing on a wing, grinning, his whole life ahead of him. "That boy carried this picture for 15 years, the stranger said, trying to find the man who saved him. He wrote to the War Department. He wrote to the Squadron Association. All he ever had was a first name and a face he barely saw through the rain." Slowly, the big man took off his hat. "I've been looking for you for 15 years, Hal," he said, and his voice broke clean in two. "I was the boy. I was the tail end Charlie, and I have owed you my whole life for it." You could have heard a pin drop on cotton in that room. Dewey Frank stood frozen, with his beer forgotten in his hand. The bartender had stopped wiping the glass he'd been wiping for 5 minutes, and every man in the cattleman's tavern was staring at the old man in the threadbare coat, the man they had laughed at not 10 minutes before, and beginning to understand what they had done. But the stranger wasn't finished, because there was a thing nobody in that room knew, not even Hal. "There's more you never knew, Hal," the big man said, wiping his eyes with the back of a big hand and not caring who saw it. "That boy you saved. I didn't fly again after the war. Couldn't. But I made something of the life you gave back to me. And along the way, I made more money than one man has any business having. And for 15 years, I've spent a piece of it every year looking for you, hiring men, writing letters, chasing every dead end there was." He looked around the room now, and there was steel in it. "I found out 3 weeks ago that a man named Harold Pruitt had been living above the hardware store in this town for 13 years, working odd jobs, living on nothing, his wife buried, no family, no help. The man who saved my life, the man who gave my children their father and my grandchildren their grandfather, has been living hand to mouth in a cold room and getting laughed at in bars." He stood up. He seemed to fill the whole room. "I bought the hardware store this morning," he said, "and the building over it. It's Hal's now, free and clear, deed in his name, for as long as he lives. There's an account at the bank in his name that'll see him comfortable to the end of his days. Not charity, a debt. The oldest kind of debt there is, the kind you owe a man who traded his own safety for your life and never once asked to be paid back." He turned and looked, one at a time, at the men who had laughed. He did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. "You laughed at this man because he was poor and old and quiet," the stranger said. "Let me tell you what quiet is. Quiet is a man who does the bravest thing in his life and then spends the next 15 years never mentioning it because he'd rather you thought him a nobody than have you think he was bragging. That's not weakness, gentlemen. That is the strongest thing a man can be, and most of you have never been within a country mile of it." It was Dewey Frank who finally found his voice, and it came out small, nothing like the loud thing it had been an hour before. "Mister," he said. Who are you?" The big man settled his hat back on his head. He put a hand on Hal Pruitt's shoulder. The old man was weeping openly now, not from shame, but from the great and terrible relief of being known at last. And he steadied him, and he smiled, and for just a moment the light caught his face full on, and one of the men near the pool table made a small sound in his throat, because he had seen that face 100 times, 40 feet tall, on a movie screen. "Doesn't matter who I am," the stranger said. "What matters is who he is." But they knew. Half the men in that room knew, now, and the knowing ran through them like cold water. He turned back to Hal. "Come on, old friend," he said gently. "I've got a warm car outside and a whole lot of years to catch up on, and I'd be honored, truly honored, if you'd let me buy you dinner. Not because you need it, because I've been waiting 15 years to sit across a table from the man who saved my life, and I'm not going to wait one more night." Hal Pruitt picked up his tin box with hands that had finally, at long last, stopped shaking. He put the silver wings back inside. He looked at the young man who had laughed at him, at Dewey Frank, whose face was a ruin of shame, and old Hal, who had every right in the world to be bitter, said only this: "It's all right, son. You didn't know. Most folks don't. That's how it's supposed to be." And then the two of them, the tall man and the old one, walked out of the cattleman's tavern together into the cold Iowa night, and the door swung shut behind them, and the barroom sat in a silence so deep you could hear the neon buzzing in the window. Nobody laughed. Not that night. Not ever again in that room. Hal Pruitt lived 9 more years, and they were good ones. He never wanted for anything again. But more than the money, more than the deed to the building, he had something he'd gone without for 13 years. He was known. The men of Cedar Falls, once they understood what they'd done, did not forget it. They made it right the slow way, the honest way, by treating an old hero like the hero he was for the rest of his natural life. Dewey Frank himself drove Hal to church every Sunday until the day the old man died, and never spoke a word of it to anyone, because some debts you pay quietly. The porch visits became the thing the town set its calendar by. Every year in the early autumn, when the corn was coming off and the maples along Main Street were turning, a long, dark car would roll into Cedar Falls, and word would go up and down the street before the man inside it had even opened the door. "He's here. The Duke's here. He's come to see Hal." And the two old friends would climb the outside stairs to the little apartment above the hardware store, and they would sit on the porch that the stranger had built with his own hands the second summer, 2 rocking chairs and a small table between them, and they would talk until the light went out of the sky. Nobody eavesdropped. That was an unspoken law in Cedar Falls now. A boy who lingered too long on the sidewalk below that porch would get his ear pulled by whatever adult was nearest. But folks passing by could hear the low murmur of 2 voices, and now and then the sudden bark of the big man's laughter, and once in a while a long silence that everyone understood to mean the two of them were sitting with the ghosts of men who never came home. Dewey Frank, who had done more penance than anyone, who had become in his middle years one of the kindest men in that county, brought them a pie every year from his own kitchen. He would leave it on the bottom step and knock once and go, and he never once climbed those stairs, because he felt he hadn't earned the right, and neither man ever corrected him on it, and that too was a kind of understanding. The last visit came in the autumn of 1967. Hal was failing by then. The whole town could see it. The big man stayed a full week that year instead of a single evening. He carried Hal's chair out to the porch himself every morning, and he tucked a blanket around the old man's knees, and he did not care one bit who saw the biggest star in America playing nursemaid to a dying man above a hardware store in Iowa. On the last morning, before he left, the stranger stood a long time at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at the porch where Hal sat wrapped in his blanket in the thin autumn sun. And Hal raised one hand, the hand that had once refused to turn a Mustang toward home, and held it up in the air, the way one pilot signals another that he's cleared to go. And the big man raised his own hand back, and held it there. And then he got in his car and drove away, and both of them knew, the way you know a true thing all at once, that it was the last time. When Hal Pruitt died in the autumn of 1968, they found the tin box on his nightstand. Inside were the silver wings, the folded photograph, and one thing more, a thing Hal had added in his last years. A letter, in a big, bold hand, written on plain paper. The letter is behind glass now, in a small aviation museum in eastern Iowa, beside a set of tarnished silver wings and a photograph of a grinning young pilot standing on the wing of a P-51. The placard beneath it names Harold Pruitt, 362nd Fighter Squadron, and tells the story of the boy he saved over Germany. It does not name the man who wrote the letter. He asked that his name be kept off of it, right up to the end. But folks who lean in close to the glass can read the letter for themselves. And it says this: "To the finest man I ever knew. You went back into the storm for a stranger and never asked a thing for it. I spent my whole life trying to be worth what you did that day. I never quite managed it. But I tried, Hal. Every day of my life, I tried. Your friend always, Marion." And the ones who know their history, the ones who remember that a certain famous man was born Marion Robert Morrison before the whole world came to know him by another name, those folks step back from the glass a little slower than they stepped up to it. Because they understand then exactly who stood up in that bar in 1959. And they understand that the biggest man in America crossed a cold room to stand beside the smallest, and named a squadron, and paid a debt, and asked for nothing in return but the honor of buying an old friend dinner. They laughed at an old man who told the truth, and then a legend stood up and made the whole room understand that the quietest man at the bar had been, all along, the bravest one in it. They don't make men like that anymore, but they made a few. And as long as we tell their stories, they're never really gone. This has been a fictional, dramatized tribute inspired by the values John Wayne represented: courage, humility, and standing up for the ones the world overlooks. It is not a factual account of real people or events.